It began quietly, almost like a rumor carried on the wind. A man named David Lawson had worked for years to carve out a place of peace on the edge of town. He was a black rancher, soft-spoken but steady, a man who had inherited little except the wisdom of his grandfather and the determination of his mother. His land wasn't large compared to the sprawling estates nearby, but it was his, bought fair, paid for in full, and cared for with the kind of pride that comes from knowing every inch of earth has been earned. For David, the ranch was more than a home. It was a place where his children could run barefoot through tall grass, where horses grazed under the wide sky, and where neighbors, at least the decent ones, could share in the bounty of fresh eggs, vegetables, and the occasional barbecue. The soil carried his sweat, his calloused hands had mended every fence post, and the quiet of the land gave him a kind of dignity that no one could take away, or so he thought. The trouble began not with a knock on his door, but with a fence. One morning, as David walked out to tend to the horses, he noticed fresh posts hammered into the ground, running like a scar across the perimeter of his property. Confused, he followed the line until it became clear. Someone had boxed him in. The fence was high, uninvited, and unyielding. Where once he had open access to the main road, now there was only wood and wire. A barrier. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, had struck. David knew of them, of course. They had never looked kindly on his ranch. His land didn't fit the polished image they wanted to present to the world. The HOA preferred manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and houses that looked nearly identical, as though individuality was a crime. To them, David's ranch was out of place. It was too real, too rugged, too black. They had fined him before for things that weren't even in their bylaws. A tractor parked on his own gravel drive. A chicken coop they said was unsightly. Even the color of his barn door. Each time he resisted, standing firm with paperwork, lawyers, and patience. Each time they found another way to remind him, "You don't belong here." But this fence was different. This wasn't a notice in the mailbox or a letter full of legal jargon. This was a wall meant to humiliate. Overnight, they had cut off his access to his own ranch, leaving only one narrow gate. And that gate, David learned, was locked. The key wasn't his. He stood before that locked gate one afternoon, the sun pressing heat against his back, and felt something burn inside him. It wasn't just anger. It was history. He thought of his grandfather, who had been forced to step off sidewalks so white men could pass, who had built a life out of scraps and still kept his head high. He thought of his mother, who marched for civil rights with blistered feet but never lost her voice. And now here he was, in the year of so-called progress, staring at a fence built not just to control land but to diminish the man who owned it. Neighbors talked. Some whispered sympathy, others watched in silence. A few even smirked when they drove by, pleased to see the HOA flex its muscle. But David refused to bow. Instead of reacting with fury, he did what his family had always done. He planned. Quietly, carefully, patiently. He studied the documents, combed through property records, and spoke with an attorney who respected him not as a client, but as a man demanding dignity. And in that search, David discovered something extraordinary. The very strip of land where the gate stood, the land the HOA claimed as theirs, was up for sale. It wasn't advertised, not publicly, but it was listed quietly through the county. The owner, tired of the HOA's endless regulations, had decided to sell off the small but crucial parcel. It was the only access point, the only gate that opened to the world beyond the fence. And in that moment, David saw a door. He moved swiftly but silently. He gathered the funds, reached out to the seller, and made the purchase without fanfare. The HOA had thought they had cornered him, caged him in like a man with no options. But they had forgotten. David had always lived by turning barriers into opportunities. His grandfather had turned rejection into work. His mother had turned oppression into activism. And now he, too, would turn their cruelty into his victory. Weeks later, when the paperwork was finalized, David walked once more to the gate. But this time, the key was in his hand. The rest lock that once mocked him now opened at his command. The land, the path, the gate, every inch belonged to him. The HOA's fence had not imprisoned him. It had instead led him straight to ownership of the very thing they had tried to control. News spread quickly. Some neighbors were astonished. Others tried to hide their resentment behind forced smiles. The HOA, red-faced and silent, realized too late that their arrogance had become their downfall. In trying to humiliate him, they had handed him the greatest victory. Not only freedom of access, but power over the very gate they had used to keep him out. For David, it wasn't about revenge. He didn't stand before that gate to gloat. He stood there with his children, placed the key in his son's small hand, and said quietly, "This is ours. No one can take this from you." It was a lesson far deeper than land or fences. It was about dignity, ownership, and the quiet strength of a man who refused to let hatred define his life. The HOA had tried to write him out of their community, but he had written himself back in, with ink stronger than any regulation: ownership. And yet, behind the triumph, the weight of history lingered. For David, the fight was never just about one fence or one gate. It was about the centuries of walls built around black men and women in America. Walls meant to confine their opportunities, to limit their reach, to shrink their dreams. Every barrier told the same lie: you don't belong here. And every act of defiance, small or great, echoed the same truth: we belong everywhere. Our hard work, our dignity, and our humanity carry us. So when David unlocked that gate for the first time, he didn't just walk through it. He carried his ancestors with him. He carried every story of resilience, every scar, every prayer whispered by those who had been fenced in before him. And he carried a message to his children, his neighbors, and even the HOA that sought to silence him. Walls can be built, but they can also be owned, and the key to freedom can be claimed by the very hands they try to bind. The ranch remained, strong and steady under the wide sky. Horses still grazed, children still laughed, and David still rose each morning with work to do. But now when he walked to the edge of his land and opened the gate, he did so with the quiet pride of a man who had turned oppression into ownership. And though the HOA would continue to exist, with its rules and its arrogance, one truth could never be erased: the man they tried to box in had become the man who owned the way out. The weeks that followed were strange, almost surreal. Where once David's neighbors had driven past his ranch without a glance, now they slowed, their eyes drawn to the gate that stood like a silent declaration of victory. Some waved awkwardly, unsure of where they stood in the aftermath. Others avoided him entirely, ashamed or bitter, unable to admit that the man they had underestimated now held more authority than the entire HOA combined. The HOA board members were furious but powerless. They held meeting after meeting, whispering in heated voices, drafting letters filled with legal threats. But none of it mattered. The law was on David's side now, not theirs. He owned the gate. He owned the path. And without his permission, no one could move through that entrance. For the first time in years, David felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: peace. Not the fragile peace of tolerating injustice, but the grounded peace of knowing he had overcome it. And yet, beneath that peace, there was something deeper, something far more enduring: pride. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson, David sat on his porch, sipping coffee. His son came to him, holding the key to the gate in his small hand, and asked a question only a child could ask with such innocence. "Daddy, why did they build the fence if it wasn't theirs?" David looked at his boy and felt the weight of generations pressing on his heart. He answered slowly, carefully, the way his own grandfather once spoke to him. "Because sometimes, son, people think they can control what they fear. They think they can draw a line and keep us out. But fences don't decide who we are. What matters is who holds the key, and we do." The boy nodded, his young mind already beginning to grasp what his father was teaching. It wasn't just about wood, nails, or property lines. It was about dignity. It was about the right to exist, to stand tall, to claim space in a world that too often tried to shrink black men into shadows. Word of David's quiet victory spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends called, distant relatives reached out, and even local activists spoke of his story as a reminder of what resilience could accomplish. His ranch became more than a piece of land. It became a symbol. People began to see in David's triumph a reflection of their own struggles against invisible fences. At work, in schools and housing, in every place where doors seemed locked without keys. But victory did not mean the end of the struggle. The HOA continued to probe, to search for loopholes, to find new ways to remind David that his presence was unwelcome. They fined him again for the color of his barn. They claimed his tractor was too visible from the road. They even argued about the sound of his horses at dawn. Each time, David responded not with rage, but with the same calm determination, proof, documentation, and the strength of ownership. The key in his pocket was more than metal. It was leverage. It was protection. And through it all, David never forgot the larger meaning. Every time he opened the gate, he thought of those who never had such a chance. He thought of the men and women who had been forced to live behind real walls, slavery, segregation, redlining, walls reinforced not by boards and wire, but by laws and hatred. He thought of his grandfather stepping off that sidewalk. He thought of his mother, hoarse from chanting in marches. And he thought of the countless unnamed voices who had fought simply for the right to breathe free. One Sunday, his mother came to visit. She was older now, her steps slow but steady, her eyes still carrying that fierce spark. She stood with him by the gate, touched the iron with her wrinkled hands and said, "Your granddaddy would be proud." David swallowed hard. "I hope so." She smiled softly. "No, baby, I know so. Because what you did here, this is what we've always prayed for. Not just freedom from offense, but freedom with dignity. Ownership. They can build walls, but when you own the door, that's power they can never take." Her words sank into him like water into dry earth. He realized then that the victory wasn't his alone. It belonged to all of them, past, present, and future. In time, the HOA grew quieter. They still wrote letters, still called meetings, still looked for cracks in his armor. But the neighborhood, once indifferent, began to change. Some neighbors who had stayed silent started speaking up. They invited his family to dinners, to community events, to gatherings where before they had been excluded. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice never disappeared overnight. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. And David, for his part, met them with grace. Not weakness, but grace. He shook hands, accepted invitations, and let his children play with theirs. He knew forgiveness didn't erase history, but it allowed for a future where fences mattered less than shared humanity. Still, the gate remained. Strong. Locked when he wanted, open when he chose. A reminder to everyone who passed. Respect cannot be given or taken at the whim of others. Respect is built, defended, and owned. Years later, when his children were grown, they would tell the story of the fence and the gate. They would tell it to their children, and those children would tell it to theirs. Not as a tale of bitterness, but as a lesson in dignity. They would remember how one man turned an act of humiliation into a legacy of strength. They would remember that when others tried to wall him in, he bought the ground beneath their feet. And so, the ranch lived on, not just as land, but as testimony. The horses still grazed, the children still laughed, and the gate still stood, a silent witness to the truth that walls may rise, but the spirit that breaks them, or better yet owns them, is far stronger. For in the end, David's story wasn't just about a fence or a gate. It was about what it means to live free in a world that still tries to draw lines around you. It was about Black dignity in the face of discrimination, about courage in the face of cruelty, and about resolution in the face of resistance. It was about a man who refused to be caged. It was about a man who turned the key and walked through, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." Because the truth, spoken plainly and lived boldly, is this: we do belong, everywhere, and no fence will ever change that. Years rolled forward, as years always do. The fence itself weathered and grayed under the seasons, boards splintering, wires loosening, until it no longer stood as a weapon, but as a reminder. Grass pushed up against its edges, vines twisted themselves around it, and time did what time always does. It made the arrogant look small. David, now older, still rose before dawn. He still walked the land with steady steps, the key always tucked into his pocket. But there was something different about the way he carried himself. It was not the defiance of a man under siege, but the quiet strength of someone who had already fought his battle and won. The community had shifted too. New families moved in, younger and more open-minded, less chained to the rigid codes of the past. They saw the ranch not as an eyesore, but as a landmark, a story to be told. Sometimes young neighbors would stop at the fence, not to complain, but to ask questions. Is it true, they'd ask, that the HOA tried to shut you out? David would nod. He would tell them the story not with anger, but with the calm of a teacher. He explained how walls are built not just from wood and nails, but from fear, and how ownership of land, of self, of dignity was the answer. And the young people listened. They listened because the story was not just about one man's gate. It was about the walls they saw in their own lives, in classrooms, in offices, in boardrooms. They understood that fences take many shapes. His children had grown too. His son, the boy who once held the key with wide-eyed wonder, was now a man himself. He often returned to the ranch, bringing his own family, and each time he did, he made sure to walk his children to the gate. This, he'd say, holding the key aloft, is more than a lock. It's a lesson. It's about knowing your worth and never letting anyone decide it for you. For his daughter, who had become a lawyer, the story fueled her fire. She remembered watching her father battle the HOA with documents, signatures, and laws. She remembered the nights when he spread papers across the kitchen table, reading late into the night, determined to turn the system's own language into his weapon. That memory shaped her path. She took on cases others were too afraid to touch: housing discrimination, unfair evictions, zoning disputes that targeted Black families. Each time she stood in a courtroom, she carried her father's victory inside her. And in that way, the fence that once tried to diminish him had instead given birth to a legacy of empowerment. But the meaning stretched even wider than family. In Black churches, in barbershops, in community centers, David's story was retold. Sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened, but always carrying the same core truth. When they built a wall to box him in, he bought the ground beneath it. It became folklore, a living parable of dignity. Elders spoke of it as proof that patience, strategy, and ownership could outlast any attempt at exclusion. Young activists repeated it as fuel for their own battles, their own gates, their own locked doors. David himself never sought fame. He didn't march into meetings to boast. He didn't gloat in front of the HOA. He simply lived. He let his actions and his gait speak louder than words. But sometimes in the quiet of night, he would walk alone to the edge of the ranch, unlock the gate, and stand there. He would breathe deeply, as though the air itself tasted different on that side of the fence, and whisper to the wind, "We're still here." Because survival, too, was victory. And yet he knew that his story was only one among many. For every gate he had unlocked, there were still others closed to people who looked like him. Job interviews where resumes went unread, banks where loans were denied, schools where children were underestimated, courtrooms where sentences were harsher. The fences were everywhere, and the keys were too few. But his victory was proof that keys existed. Proof that with persistence, knowledge, and courage, locks could be turned. One evening, his mother passed away. The family gathered, mourning but also celebrating the long, resilient life she had lived. At her funeral, David stood before family and friends and told the story of the fence. He told it because it wasn't just about land or property. It was about her, about how she had marched, sacrificed, endured, and prayed, about how her strength had shaped his, and how her spirit had lived on in that gate. When he finished, he lifted the key from his pocket, held it high, and said, "This is hers. This belongs to every ancestor who was told no, every ancestor who was fenced in, every ancestor who dreamed of opening the way." And in that moment, the key was no longer just a piece of metal. It was an heirloom. As the years moved further along, David grew frailer. His steps slowed, his hair turned silver, but his presence never dimmed. And when the time came, when his hands could no longer hold tools and his body could no longer tend the land, he passed the ranch to his children. Along with it, he passed the key. They held it as something sacred, not because it opened a gate of wood and iron, but because it opened a story of resilience, a story of dignity, a story of victory born from injustice. And long after David was gone, the story lived. It lived each time his daughter stood in court, defending someone against unfair treatment. It lived each time his son placed the key in his own child's palm and told them, "This is who we are." It lived each time a young person in the community said, "If David Lawson could face down a wall and win, then so can I." The HOA, as institutions do, eventually dissolved, replaced by new boards, new faces, new names. The fence decayed, was taken down, and forgotten by all except those who remembered what it once symbolized. But the gate remained sturdy, strong, a reminder that victory had been carved from its shadow. And so the story of the black man in the fence became more than local memory. It became legend. Not because it was loud, but because it was lasting. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was dignified. Because in the end, this was never just about one man in his land. It was about every barrier that has ever been placed before black people, every attempt to shrink their world, every fence meant to say, "You don't belong." And it was about the truth that has always risen higher. We do belong. We always have. We always will. And when the gates are locked, we will find the key. Or better yet, we will own it. Stories like David's do not end with the closing of a chapter. They ripple outward, like a stone dropped into a still pond, touching shores unseen. His fight with the HOA over a fence and a gate was not an isolated struggle. It was a reflection of countless battles fought across generations, across neighborhoods, across the span of black life in America. Each fence, each wall, each locked door has always carried the same message: stay in your place. And each act of resistance has carried the same reply: our place is wherever we choose to stand. The beauty of David's story lies not only in his personal victory, but in the timeless lesson it teaches: that ownership is power, ownership of land, ownership of identity, ownership of dignity. When he bought the property with the only gate key, he did more than outmaneuver the HOA. He reclaimed agency over his own life in a world that so often works to strip black men of precisely that. But ownership is not limited to deeds and documents. It is also ownership of voice, ownership of history, ownership of the narrative. For too long, stories about black struggle have been told through the lens of those who built the fences. But David's story reminds us, we must be the authors. We must tell it as it was lived, raw, unbroken, and triumphant. In every generation, there are Davids, men and women who face walls, who stare down locked gates, who hear the echoes of dismissal in boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms. Some find keys in unexpected places. Some build their own gates. Some tear down the walls entirely. And each of them contributes to a larger truth: that resilience is not only survival, it is legacy. When we revisit the image of David placing the key in his son's hand, we see more than a father teaching a lesson. We see centuries of history converging in a single gesture. That key was not merely iron. It was the weight of ancestors who tilled soil they did not own, who built homes they were not allowed to live in, who labored under systems that called them less than human. It was the silent prayer of every man and woman who dared to dream of freedom while standing behind real bars. It was the answer to every whispered doubt. Do I belong? The key said, yes, you belong. You always have. And yet the struggle is not finished. Even today, new fences rise. They take different forms, wearing the disguise of policy, bureaucracy, subtle bias. They appear in mortgage applications denied without cause, in schools where resources are stripped from black communities, in workplaces where advancement stalls behind invisible barriers. These are fences every bit as real as the one the HOA built around David's ranch. And the question remains, who will hold the key? The answer must be all of us. Ownership is not only personal, it is collective. Every story of resistance, every act of resilience, every step forward belongs to the community. Just as David's victory became a symbol for his children and neighbors, so too must we pass on the keys we hold. Keys of knowledge, keys of opportunity, keys of justice. We must place them in the hands of those who come after us, whispering the same words David whispered to his son: this is ours. No one can take it from you. And in that passing, something extraordinary happens. The fence that once felt permanent becomes temporary. The gate that once locked us out becomes a doorway we own. The attempt to humiliate becomes a story of pride. Hatred transforms into fuel for triumph. David's story also teaches us something vital about patience and strategy. His victory did not come from rage alone, though rage was justified. It came from careful planning, from understanding the system, from wielding knowledge as a weapon. He turned the very tools meant to confine him into instruments of liberation. That is a lesson for us today, that justice is not always swift, but it is possible. That silence is not weakness when it is the quiet before a move that changes everything. That victory comes not only through force, but through wisdom. And yet, let us not romanticize the struggle. The pain was real. The humiliation was sharp. The loneliness of being fenced in, mocked and excluded, cannot be erased simply because the ending was triumphant. It is important to acknowledge this too, that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering define the end of the story. So when we tell David's story, we must tell it whole. We must tell of the long days when he stared at that fence and felt the weight of history pressing against him. We must tell of the nights when doubt crept in, when the HOA's cruelty felt overwhelming. Because in acknowledging the darkness, we magnify the light of his victory. We see that his triumph was not inevitable. It was chosen, earned, fought for, and that is why it matters. Because if one man could choose to rise when every force pushed him down, then so can we. If one family could turn a fence into a legacy, then so can we. If one key could become a symbol of freedom, then so can every barrier we face become the ground upon which we build something stronger. In the end, David's ranch stands not just as land, but as testimony. It is a reminder to every person who has ever felt fenced in by life. Your story is not over. The locks are not final. And sometimes the very wall built to keep you out will lead you to the power of owning the way through. So to everyone hearing this story, remember this. You are not defined by the fences around you. You are defined by the courage within you, the strategy you wield, the community that surrounds you, and the keys you choose to pass on. David Lawson's story is one man's story, but it is also your story, our story, a story of Black resilience, of human dignity, of victory in the face of injustice, a story that whispers across generations. We belong, we rise, we own the gate. And when the next fence is built, when the next key seems out of reach, remember David. Remember the man who refused to be caged. Remember the lesson he gave his children. And remember the truth that no wall, no board, no wire, no prejudice can ever erase. The key is ours. Always. The power of a story lies not only in how it is lived, but in how it is remembered. And David Lawson's story, the man fenced in, the man who bought the gate, the man who turned humiliation into triumph, did not fade when the boards of that fence rotted away. It lived on. It continues to live on, not in the HOA minutes or in dusty property records, but in the hearts of those who need reminders that dignity can be defended, that resilience can rewrite injustice, and that freedom once claimed becomes a torch to pass forward. Every community has its fences. Some are seen, built from wood, steel, or stone. Others are unseen, stitched into the fabric of society in subtler ways, no less real, no less heavy. And every generation has its Davids, those who stand before those fences, who feel the sting of exclusion, and who must decide whether to surrender or to rise. David's choice, to rise, to own, to transform, made his story unforgettable. Years after his passing, the ranch remains in his family. The horses still graze, the porch still creaks under the weight of rocking chairs, and the gate, his gate, still stands. Visitors often pause at it, asking to hear the story once more. And each time it is told, it grows larger than land. It becomes a metaphor for everything Black families have endured and overcome. It becomes a song of survival. In barbershops, old men lean back in chairs and retell it with the rhythm of gospel. In classrooms, teachers weave it into lessons about perseverance and justice. In churches, preachers call upon it as modern scripture. Proof that God does not abandon those who walk with faith and courage. The story is not just remembered, It is lived, echoed, repeated as if it belongs to everyone who has ever stood on the wrong side of a locked gate. And that, perhaps, is the truest victory of all. David's life became bigger than himself. His defiance became instruction. His triumph became inheritance. But with victory comes responsibility. For what good is a key if it is never shared? What good is ownership if it remains only in one hand? The lesson of David's story is not only that fences can be overcome, but that every gate unlocked should lead to a wider path for others to walk through. His children understood this. His grandchildren understand it still. That is why the Lawson family never kept the story quiet, never let it be buried as just another legal battle. They told it loudly, proudly, and often, because silence has never been safety, and stories, when spoken, can be stronger than walls. What David taught, what he lived, is that true victory is not found in revenge, nor in gloating, nor in proving someone wrong. True victory is found in dignity, in standing tall when others try to make you small, in walking through a gate with your head high, carrying the memory of those who could not. True victory is the ability to look at your children, your neighbors, your community and say, "This is ours. We earned it. We belong." And so, part 5 of this story is not about the past, but the future, about the next fences that will rise, about the next locked gates that will appear. Because they will. Prejudice has never vanished with time. It has only shifted shape. But so too has resilience. Each generation builds on the last, carrying the keys forward, finding new ways to open doors once thought sealed. Some will use knowledge. Some will use art. Some will use activism. Some will use the quiet persistence of simply staying, surviving, existing where the world said they should not. But each in their own way will be holding David's key. And so, the call to us, the listeners, the audience, the inheritors of this story, is simple but profound. Do not let the fences stop you. Do not let the gates define you. When the world says you do not belong, remember the man who took their wall and made it his doorway. Remember the key that passed from his hand to his son's. Remember that ownership of dignity, once claimed, can never be stolen. Because fences fall, boards rot, associations dissolve, but dignity, once rooted, endures. David Lawson's life is not an isolated tale of one ranch. It is the story of Black history, Black struggle, and Black triumph, condensed into a single act of defiance. It is the story of every ancestor who refused to bow, every family who refused to leave, every voice that refused to be silenced. It is the story of turning every no into a resounding yes. And so we return to the image of the gate, standing under the wide sky, strong and unyielding. It is not just wood and iron. It is a monument, a reminder that we are not defined by the walls others build, but by the doors we claim. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The world will build fences, some visible, some invisible. But your worth, your belonging, your dignity, these are not theirs to decide. They are yours to claim. And sometimes the very thing meant to confine you will become the ground upon which you stand tallest. So the next time you face a locked door, think of David Lawson. Think of the Black man who was fenced in by an HOA that thought they could strip him of dignity. Think of the man who turned that insult into ownership. And then ask yourself, what will you do with the key in your hand? Because the story does not end with him. It continues with you. It continues every time someone refuses to surrender to the fences of this world. It continues every time a locked gate becomes an open path. It continues every time dignity is chosen over despair. Every time ownership is claimed over humiliation. Every time someone whispers to themselves, "I belong." David's ranch will remain. His family will remain. His story will remain. But more importantly, his lesson will remain. We are never defined by fences. We are defined by the keys we choose to hold and the doors we dare to open. And with that truth, there is no gate we cannot own. In the stillness of early morning, the ranch wakes the way it always has. The sun spills its first light across the fields, painting the grass in gold. The horses stir, tails swishing, their breaths forming gentle clouds in the cool air. The porch, though weathered, still stands firm. And the gate that once symbolized insult, then ownership, creaks open with the familiar sound of rust and memory. Life continues here, quiet and steady, but within that quiet, the echoes of struggle remain. David Lawson is gone, yet his presence lingers in every corner. His boots still rest by the door, dust never quite brushed away. His hat hangs where he last left it. His laughter, though silent now, feels carved into the wood of the home. For those who loved him, his absence is a weight, but also a comfort, because everything he built still holds. It is often said that legacies are measured in monuments, in headlines, in awards. But sometimes they are measured in smaller things. The steadiness of a family meal shared at the same table, the laughter of children running across a yard once threatened, the knowledge that home remains home. For the Lawson family, this is the true inheritance. Not wealth, not fame, but dignity preserved. And dignity, once preserved, becomes a daily act. His children speak of him not just as a man who defied an HOA, but as a father who never let anger consume him, who taught them to read not only books but people, to recognize cruelty without becoming cruel themselves. His grandchildren carry his name into classrooms, workplaces, and communities, not as a burden, but as a banner. They know what he stood for, they know what he endured, and they know what he overcame. This is where the story softens, becomes tender. Because beyond the fences and the lawsuits, beyond the victory and the symbolism, there was simply a black man who wanted peace, who wanted to raise horses, who wanted to sit on his porch at the end of a long day and feel the wind on his face. It was this ordinary dream that was threatened, and it was this ordinary dream that he protected. Sometimes we forget that behind every headline, behind every story of resistance, there is a human being simply asking to live in peace. And so, the story of David Lawson is not just about a fence. It is about the right to breathe freely in the place you call home. It is about the right to exist without apology. It is about the quiet, powerful assertion, I am here, I belong, this is mine. As years turn into decades, the ranch itself will change. Paint will peel. New boards will be nailed to old fences. Children will grow, and grandchildren will inherit. Time, relentless as it is, will carry forward. But the essence of the story, what the ranch means, will not fade. Because every family member who walks through that gate will know they are walking in the footsteps of a man who refused to let shame define him. And the community will know too. Long after the HOA has been forgotten, people will remember the man who bought the key. The story will be retold not because of its drama, but because of its truth. And truth, when spoken with clarity, has a way of living forever. For those who listen, there is a lesson here. Resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting on his porch after a long fight, rocking gently in his chair, knowing the land under him is truly his. Sometimes it looks like peace after storm. Sometimes it looks like silence after struggle. But that silence is not empty. It is full. Full of meaning, full of strength, full of the knowledge that dignity, once reclaimed, is unshakable. So if you ever find yourself standing before a fence, literal or otherwise, remember this. You do not have to break it down with fury. Sometimes the most powerful act is to own it, to turn it into part of your story, to make it yours. That is what David Lawson did, and that is why we remember him. The ranch, the gate, the legacy, it is all still here. But what lingers most is the lesson, that a man's worth is never decided by the barriers built around him, that freedom can be claimed in ways both grand and quiet, that dignity once chosen cannot be taken away. And so, as the sun sets again over the Lawson Ranch, painting the sky in hues of fire and dusk, the story closes not with noise, but with peace, a peace earned, a peace deserved, a peace that will last long after the wood has crumbled and the grass has grown wild. Because the story of David Lawson is not just about a battle fought, it is about a life lived with courage. And that, more than anything, is what endures. And now we arrive at the end. The story of David Lawson has been told, from humiliation to triumph, from injustice to legacy. But what lingers most is not the fence, nor the courtrooms, nor even the gate with its single key. What lingers is the question this story places gently but firmly in your hands. What will you do with it? Because this was never just about one man's ranch. It was about something far larger. It was about the ways a world can tell someone they don't belong, and the courage it takes to say, yes, I do. It was about the quiet wars fought in backyards and neighborhoods, wars over respect, dignity, and place. It was about a black man who refused to let small-minded cruelty dictate the size of his spirit. And in that refusal, there is a lesson for us all. Maybe you know what it feels like to stand at a gate someone else locked. Maybe you felt the sting of being told you are too much or not enough. Maybe the world has tried to shrink you, to box you in, to surround you with invisible fences meant to keep you contained. But here's the truth David Lawson teaches us. No fence can hold a soul that has already claimed its freedom. They may build barriers around your body, your home, your dreams, but they cannot touch your will unless you hand it to them. And if you refuse, if you stand, if you claim the key, then even the barriers themselves become monuments to your strength. This is the power of dignity. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. It is not permission, it is declaration. It is the voice inside that says, I belong here, and I will not be moved. For Black lives, this lesson runs deep. Across generations, across centuries, there have always been gates locked against us. Slavery was a gate. Segregation was a gate. Discrimination in housing, in jobs, in justice, each one a fence meant to remind us of limits. And yet, time and again, we have found the key. Sometimes in protest, sometimes in law, sometimes in art, sometimes simply in living our lives boldly in the face of those who wanted us silent. David Lawson's story is another key added to that long chain. It is not the first and it will not be the last, but it matters because it reminds us. Ordinary people carry extraordinary strength. A man who just wanted peace on his land ended up becoming a symbol of resistance, of ownership, of dignity reclaimed. And so, what does this mean for you? It means when you face your fence, whatever it may be, you do not have to surrender. You do not have to rage in vain. You can stand with dignity. You can find the key. You can rewrite the story. And it means when you see someone else fenced in, when you witness injustice, you cannot look away. Because silence is its own kind of gate, locking people out of compassion, out of solidarity. The story asks you to step forward, to lend your voice, your strength, your presence. David Lawson is gone, but his gate still stands, not just on his ranch, but in the memory of everyone who tells his story. And each time we tell it, we turn that gate from a symbol of cruelty into a symbol of triumph. So when you leave this story, do not leave empty-handed. Leave carrying the lesson. Leave carrying the dignity. Leave carrying the quiet power that comes from knowing fences can be turned into victories and shame into strength. Because this is more than his story, it is ours. And it does not end here. It lives on each time someone refuses to be diminished, each time someone claims their place, each time someone, faced with a locked gate, decides not to wait for permission, but to own the key. Remember this, dignity is not what they give you. It is what you choose to carry. And when you carry it, no fence, no gate, no barrier can ever take it away. So go forward and live with the quiet, unshakable power of David Lawson. Stand tall, stand proud. And when the world builds a fence around you, remember the key is already in your hands. This is the end of the story, but it is the beginning of what you will do with it.